Alright, aside from the box that I used to contain the diorama, every other file I used on this project was found for free online. I will link them as well as all the other materials I used down in the description below. I had this idea to turn the diorama into an infinity book nook. I had seen lots of different versions of the infinity book nook online, but most of them only feature a single mirror panel in the back, and so I didn't know if it would actually be possible to do a full enclosure of mirrors. But after lots of broken mirrors and fiddling with the exact position of the trees, I finally had something that I thought might work. So to be sure I didn't forget the position of anything, I traced around each of the trees and took a stencil of the exact angle of the mirrors in the back. And here's the box that will contain the smaller box that will hold the diorama, but we'll touch on that later. Okay, back to the figures. The Ewok and the Scout Trooper I found on Thingiverse, but I could not find a version of Luke that would fit the look I needed for this scene. However, I did find what I think is a video game file of Luke, and after combining that with a Rebel helmet I found on Thingiverse and a poncho from a game file for Cal Kestis from Jedi Fallen Order, I moved over to Adobe's Mixamo.com. I have almost no knowledge when it comes to 3D modeling, and so this site is a great resource if you're somebody like me who knows next to nothing about posing figures. Once I've downloaded the animation that I want, I take that file back into Blender and export a single frame of the animation as an STL. And there you have it, a posed figure all for the low price of free. Now on to the work that is honestly going to take up the bulk of this project. Going into this, I knew that if I was going to build a convincing forest, I would need tons and tons of greenery. And because money doesn't grow on trees here at BrungerBuilds, I knew I'd need to make most of this greenery by hand. So what you see me doing here is grinding up a big bag of wood chips that I got from my friend who is a woodworker. This was slow going, but the end product was worth it. From there, I mixed those wood chips with some paint in a food processor. I added different colors like yellow and brown to each batch so that in the end I was left with a few color options. I then left them to dry in front of a fan till the next day. Next on my list was building tiny ferns. Ferns are all over the redwood forest, and so I knew if I was going to do Endor justice, I need to include a lot of these guys. And so to do that, I just chopped off the very tip of these moss strands and very carefully placed them in PVA glue. Once this first layer had dried, I went back with a little more glue and added 1 to 2 more branches to each fern. Next up, I made a couple batches of turf that in the end looks exactly like Woodland Scenics turf. I showed the first few steps of processing the foam in my Hoth diorama build, but essentially it's just foam pad soaked in matte Mod Podge and PVA glue. And then once that dries, I blend it into different consistencies using my food processor. Here I just added different shades of green to the leftover foam I had laying around. And then it was on to building tiny trees. For this, I just picked up a bunch of twigs in my backyard and covered them in PVA glue and tea leaves. Once the tea leaves had dried, I did another coat of PVA glue and then sprinkled them with the foam that I had made earlier. I also picked up a bunch of plants that I felt like could work for different types of foliage, and after covering them first with a coat of matte brown, I painted them green. I started off with a base layer of dark green for all the plants, and then slowly worked brighter, doing 1 to 2 more passes of different colors. I wasn't being very scientific here, just adding different yellows or greens or white to brighten my shade as I went. It's also important to note that I was only painting from the top down on all these plants. That way I was just hitting the highest edges with my brighter shades and not covering the darker shades that had already been applied. To make my life a bit easier, I resin printed all of the larger tree trunks. I cut a few of them in half before printing so that I could lay them flat against the mirror, and my hope was that with the reflection, it would appear as one whole trunk. After marking out the position where I thought the branches should start, I drilled a bunch of holes in each trunk, and using a little bit of super glue, installed more twigs from my backyard. I then covered all the trunks in a coat of flat brown. After that base layer of flat brown had dried, I began to paint the trunks. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that I'm incredibly inexperienced when it comes to painting miniatures, but something that I'm learning is you can't really go wrong painting a piece with 3 to 4 different shades of a color. Here, I'm starting off with that base layer of dark brown, and then slowly working lighter with each coat. And as I dry brush each layer, I'm not just getting lighter in color, but also lighter in my brush's touch. In the end, these are pretty simple looking trees, but I knew that I'd be able to add a bit more detail later down the road. These next couple of steps I got from watching one of Luke Towan's many tree building videos. I first cut up a couple of cheap paintbrushes and then using some spray adhesive, sprinkled those bristles all over the twigs. Once this step was done, I did a little bit of trimming so that all the trees fit nicely together inside the box. I then covered the branches with another coat of spray adhesive, and while it was still wet, sprinkled down my dark green wood chips. Once the adhesive had dried, I shook off the excess leaves and began painting the few trunks that had exposed wood. For this, I just used a slightly oranger brown to try and mimic the colors of the redwoods, and then because I felt like it was still a bit too orange, I knocked it back with a brown wash. And then once that wash had dried, I did a very light dry brushing of a lighter shade. If you've been watching the channel for any amount of time, you know that I love using pastel chalks for weathering, and I figured this would be a great way to replicate moss at this scale. To make the trees look a bit more dirty at the ground level, I first started out with a coat of brown and black chalk, mixing it with matte Mod Podge, and just dabbing it around, trying to be as organic as possible in my application. Because I knew I would be doing a lot of moss, I also bought this pigment powder from AK Interactive to act as my base layer for the darker shade of green. I then applied some sporadic dabs of matte Mod Podge and sprinkled the brighter shades of chalk. Alright, now for the box. Because this is a pretty uninteresting step in the process, I'll just tell it to you quickly. After filling, I sanded. Then I primed. Then I painted it semi-gloss black and shot it with Vallejo metal color. Then I liquid masked and shot it with truck bed liner. I covered the truck bed liner in a dark gray primer and then removed my liquid mask. I then painted a couple details and covered the whole thing in a dark wash. And lastly, I applied a single strip of LED lighting in the top. Okay, on to the base. Like I've said before, I'm pretty new to the world of diorama building, and so needless to say, I was pretty nervous at this point, and I was worried I was going to screw the whole thing up. I didn't really know if I should go about building the entire base and then installing the trees, or install the trees first and then build the base around that. I felt like installing the trees first would be the best option since it would lend itself well to a more organic look once it came time to add the ground cover over the roots of the trees. But I also felt like applying the trees first was a bad idea because it would make it harder to work on the ground cover since the trees circled the entire base. In the end, I decided to install the trees first and just hope to God that I'd be able to reach my tools in there and finish up the finer details. I used a combination of super glue and 5-minute epoxy to install the trees. And to be sure that I was installing these trees so that they would sit flat against the mirrors, I built this second box special, a hair tighter, to mimic the position that the mirrors would be in. I did this because I didn't want my mirrors getting scratched or dirty throughout this entire process. And then once the glue had dried, I carefully removed it from the box and began the ground cover. I first laid down a healthy coat of watered down PVA glue, and then began sprinkling some ground up peat moss over the whole base. I then soaked that with more watered down glue. While everything was still wet, I installed a few of the details. I then came back the next day to finalize all the greenery. Like I said earlier, the key to a realistic forest is just layering greenery upon greenery upon greenery. Because nothing in nature is symmetrical, I was really trying to apply everything pretty sporadically, while also keeping in mind my final layout with the figures, knowing that I needed some space for Luke to stand and the speeder bike to sit, and I didn't want to overcrowd those areas, but I still wanted the entire thing to feel rich with life. Speaking of Luke and the Scout Trooper, let's talk about painting. I started out with a zenithal highlight. That's just a fancy way of saying first a coat of black, and then spraying white from the top. Like I said earlier, I'm extremely new to painting figurines, and I think if you handed me something at a larger scale, I'd do a terrible job painting it. But what I like about these 1/72nd scale figures is that it's really easy to cheat detail. And what I mean by that is, as long as you nail the placement of a few key colors and then give it a slight dry brushing for a highlight layer, you can really trick the eye into feeling like there's more going on than there actually is. And so I feel like building at this scale really lends itself well to my strengths. Anyway, this isn't to brag, but just to encourage anybody else watching these videos that it really is a lot easier than you think it might be. And so if you're at all interested in building things at this scale, I think you should give it a go. While I'm painting the figures, I thought it'd be a good time to let you know that I sell posters on my Etsy page. They're my slightly updated take on some vintage posters that were sold in Star Tours back in the 80s, with a few originals worked in there as well. Anyway, it's currently the best way to support the channel, so if you're interested, check them out. Thank you. So, you may have noticed in the previous section that I was painting two different versions of Luke. And that's because I didn't know up until this point whether or not I would actually be able to make this idea work. Off camera, I went through a few different variations of this idea, but eventually landed on using this EL wire that is 1.2 millimeters thick. This stuff is not LED, and I think it works by making a coating on the inside of the wire glow. But I'm not entirely sure, so fact check me on that. Anyway, it was the smallest possible round thing that glowed that I could find, and it was my last-ditch effort to making this idea a reality. I ended up having to cut off both of Luke's hands in order to get the wire to fit inside his grip, and I'm not entirely happy with the way the lead sticks right out of the ground. But I did my best to hide it, and in the end, I think it's still a pretty convincing effect. But I'll let you be the judge in the upcoming glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. This project ended up being quite the handful, and there were a lot of times where I felt like I was banging my head against a brick wall. But in the end, everything came together, and I'm very happy with the final result. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a new video every Saturday. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good day.